Listen only mode.
Hi, welcome. This is Suzanne de Beaumont from the Open Doors program at NYAIL. And today we welcome the Self-Advocacy Association of New York State, SANES, who are going to be doing a training on cultural competency and working with people with developmental disabilities. A few housekeeping things first. You are able to ask questions. In order to ask a question, you can either type into the question box or you can also raise your hand with your menu on the side. If you would like to be able to ask a question out loud, just raise your hand and I will unmute you so that you can ask your question. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to Arnold over at SANES.
Well, hi, everyone. Actually, so I guess we were going to begin with Shamika, but I guess what we'll do is we'll just do a quick introduction of all the presenters you could see on the screen there. So, Shamika, if you'd like to go first.
Sure. My name is Shamika Andrews, and I am the founder of Disability Empowered Consulting. I am also a peer in the Open Doors program.
And I'm Arnold Ackerley. I'm the new administrative director here at SANES. For those of you who knew Stephen Holmes, I replaced him back in January, who's happily retired.
I don't know how happily, but I'm Clint Perrin. I'm the director of policy, the old director of policy at SANES.
I'm Bridget Carey. I'm one of the supervising coordinators at the Self-Advocacy Association. I am also the parent of a child who receives services.
And I'm Sophia Roberts, and I'm also a supervising coordinator for Self-Advocacy, located in Buffalo in the Western region.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just going to take you through some history of SANES and what we do and our structure. SANES was founded by Bernard Carabello back in 1986. SANES' mission and goal is to help people with developmental disabilities learn to speak up for themselves and others. We are a nonprofit organization run by and for people with developmental disabilities. Our board of directors is 18 people who have various developmental disabilities. So the structure of SANES, we say, starts with the self-advocacy, starts with individual self-advocates, and then those self-advocates join self-advocacy groups, and those self-advocacy groups are a part of our regions. And then the regions, in each region, we have 3 representatives that make up our boards of directors.
So today we put together a broad overview of some cultural thoughts, ideas, and opinions. While you may be aware of some of these already, this is an introduction to a discussion and part of what cultural competency actually is. The training will answer a broad overview of questions regarding the laws, person first versus identity first language, marginalizing, stereotyping, and incorporating effective communication into everyday practice. So today we're going to look at what is diversity, cultural, and cultural competency. We're hoping that by the end of the presentation, we'll be breaking barriers through understanding, reviewing again person-first language and examples, the laws, regulations, and introduce people to a school of thought around awareness, openness, and respectful interaction. Examples of diversity. Next slide, please.
I'm getting a message from a person saying that they can't hear anything. It keeps saying the webinar will begin shortly. And Karen Scott is raising her hand. Can someone else say if they're also having someone else who's listening say if it's still telling them that the webinar will begin shortly? because I've started the broadcast, so everybody should be able to hear.
Sounds like it's from there.
Yeah.
I don't know how to communicate to people. You guys can hear me, right? It's Zanies? We can hear you. I raised my hand by accident. I'm hearing fine. All right. So maybe we're doing okay. So, Geraldine, why don't you try re-signing on? Actually, I'll send her an email because she can't hear me. All right. So why don't you guys go ahead as Zanies?
Okay, sure. Next slide, please. Great. So we're looking at examples of diversity. Some examples of diversity include ethnic, gender, race, religion, disability, and even thinking style. Today, we want to give you an overview and be responsible about sharing ideas and thoughts that include not only working with people with developmental and other disabilities, but cultural competence in other areas as well. Diversity equals difference. Are you seeing diversity as a strength or a weakness? We're hoping by the end of this, everyone's minds will be open and we'll see diversity as a strength. Next slide, please.
So when we talk about when we're talking about culture, we're not just talking about, like ethnic culture, religious culture. It's really about what is the culture. It's really about that person and maybe that organization or that place where that person is. So when we are, the way that we're addressing culture really is looking at the person themselves and asking them, what is helpful to them? Who is helpful to them? Who are the people that they perceive or are helpful in their community, in their culture where they are? Where do people go for help in that particular situation? And what is that person's particular pathway to independence and self-sufficiency? And one of the things that I would just like to raise up is this idea of interdependence, and that independence doesn't look the same for everyone. And is not a value for everyone. Independence and doing things by yourself is not a value for everyone. And so we might look, and some examples in our work have to do with people with significant disabilities, defining for themselves what a step forward is in independence. For some folks, it's being able to turn on and off the television and eat the food that they want to eat is their definition. So it's one of the cultural competence, and the idea of cultural competence is this idea of just being aware that there are different cultures around people, being open and curious as to what they are, and then being respectful in the way we ask questions and then the way we deal with people. And being aware that it's okay for people to correct you. We all have different definitions, and we'll talk more about that later, but being aware that people might correct you and you can say, thank you. Now I know how it is for you and how you want to define things and what the culture is around where you are living. So next slide. So when we talk about competency, we're talking about the ability to work across cultures in a way that acknowledges and respects the culture of the person, the organization being served. So we talk about awareness, openness, and respect. Awareness is awareness of your own biases, your own things that you know and maybe don't know, or that there may be things you don't know, and awareness of other cultures, learning actually about it's the culture of it can be so much as the culture of the nursing home or group home or other system that you're working with, the culture of the person or the culture of that community in that area. We across the state, there's different cultures in different regions. Being a curiousness and being open and being curious, and then being considerate of other people's feelings. So across the board, and we think of this even in terms of youth. Youth is a culture, or men or women, different kinds of things like that. So we can go to the next slide.
Okay, so one thing I think it's important to point out is when we're talking about, in this case, cultural competence in terms of, people with developmental disabilities is that there's no like universal, say, cultural norm, right? For people with developmental disabilities, there are some beliefs or views that are largely held in common. And I think that's all true of all cultures, but I think of it in terms as well of not just thinking about cultural competency in terms of large groups, but really in terms of looking at each individual as an individual. We're going to talk a little bit about how language plays into that, because it's really, you know, a significant part of that's language, but our intention is not really to necessarily be the word police here, to sort of police people's thoughts or tell them what they have to think or believe or what they have to say. But I think really the point of the whole training is to try to really put people in a space where they're going to really be able to like be aware and reflect upon their communication with others, and particularly when working with people with developmental disabilities. You know, hopefully, you know, we can share have our self-advocates share some experiences. We go through these things that'll just cause you to sort of, you know, be more reflective in this area when you're working with folks. Okay, so so did we want to?
Sure.
Yeah.
So even while we were developing this presentation, it was really fun and unique for us. We found that within our own dynamic, we have a lot of different schools of thought. One in particular is the example we give of positively conscious being PC. I tend to use politically correct in a lot of things during trainings, and Sophia gave me a little bit of a lesson about being positively conscious. So the new PC is positively conscious, conscious of the people you're working with, the language we use, and as we go into person first versus identity first, the difference between the two and why the difference matters, just to have an understanding of different perspectives. Next.
Okay. As Bridget said, you know, language is very powerful. Our words can be used to inspire, motivate, and uplift, as well as hurt and isolate an entire segment of society. It's necessary to look at the language and, you know, like we said, just be aware of who you're communicating with, and you know, as a person with a disability or without, you know, because I know for me sometimes with language, you know, if I use a certain word and I'm talking to somebody who doesn't have a disability, you know, their reaction is to correct me. You know, like I'll say, I'm a disabled person, or I'm a person with a disability, and it's like, oh, well, I don't like that word, so I think you should use this word. And that's not respecting how I want to identify myself. And, you know, it's the same with people that have disabilities communicating with each other. There are some ways that I see some of my friends describe themselves in words that I wouldn't use to describe myself, but that is their choice. And it's all about, you know, learning about each other and respecting each other's differences.
Can I jump in a section?
Absolutely.
So one thing I think is really important to acknowledge for everybody is just getting that fundamental concept down, that language really is important. It's something I saw. I worked for provider organizations in the past, people that are really, you know, you're doing the work day to day sometimes. And this is something we struggled with sometimes, is people really didn't see the value in really looking closely at their language. So it's just really important to acknowledge that, you know, the way we speak, obviously, you know, is reflective of the way we think, but it also shapes the way we think. So if you really, you know, want to be effective and be respectful, and, you know, you can't ignore really, you know, how important language is. And in general life as well, there's this great poet, Stanley Kunitz was his name, and he was actually had to flee Russia for political freedom. And it was really interesting. He used to teach in America, and he'd say to people, you know, it's funny, you Americans are so naive. You think that evil's going to come into your living room wearing big black boots, he said, but evil starts in the language. It's the way that we communicate about one another. So and I think that's really true, is understanding the power of language, right?
Next slide.
Okay, so we're going to look at person first language, and the standard set in government for using person first language came from self-advocacy and by people with developmental and other disabilities and their families. The very first self-advocacy groups were called People First, because people with intellectual and developmental disabilities were tired of being labeled and not being seen as a person. So to reference what Arnold talked about, when we're supporting providers and groups of people who may not be familiar with working with people with developmental and other disabilities, we should share that that standard set in government so that people have an awareness of appropriate language. So we want to go through some of that.
Okay. Some examples that are listed, you know, we would say, you know, handicapped or disabled people, you know, using person first language would be people with disabilities, or a person that uses a wheelchair versus a person that is confined to a wheelchair. Another example is using like, a person that has a cognitive disability versus autistic, retarded, things like that. And also, we'll go into, Bridget will go into some identity first languages, which will kind of also address some of these things as well.
I just wanted to add that when you use normal, it's better to say an able-bodied person or a person without a disability than to refer back to normal, because who's normal anyway, right? Who's really normal anyway?
Everyone.
Yeah.
So, the rule of thumb with person first is just putting the person before the disability and identifying people as people and not using a label at all if you don't really need to use one.
Right.
Exactly.
I think that's very important, because I was saying, sometimes when I'm going into a room, a group of people, the first thing they ask me is, what should I call you? And so it's like, well, my name is Shamika. You can start there. So it's like, if you don't need to mention that the person has a disability, if it's not a part of the topic or the conversation, there's really no need to bring it up. I always say that I think people around me think more about my disability than I do, because it's not, every conversation I have is not about disability. Sometimes you just talk to people about what your interests are and what you have in common. It's not all about the fact that I'm in this wheelchair. I mean, if you see me, you can see that I'm in a wheelchair. But, so it doesn't always have to be so focused on that. You just have a normal conversation with people.
Just to chime in about that for a minute, some people may have an invisible disability, and it's not our right to disclose their invisible disability all the time. It's up to the choice of the person to disclose that. Clint, would you mind sharing with us a little bit of a very famous example of person first language and a change?
So instead of me, you do this.
Just wait a second.
We can go to the next slide.
Back several years ago, our Office for People with Developmental Disabilities had another name, the Office of Mental Retardation and Developmental Disabilities. We were very involved in getting that name changed. And we did.
People for self-advocacy groups, a lot of the nonprofit agencies that serve people with developmental disabilities also took the R word, which we call it the R word, out of their titles, because that word has, become an insult in our society. And so this is just some of the advocacy. All of these things have come from advocacy, the ways that people are defining themselves. You can go to the next slide.
No, I'm sorry. This is something Self-Advocacy. If you're listening, Mr. Sarah, I am not mental retardation. I am not developmental disability. I am not
Emotionally disabled.
emotionally disabled. I am me.
And that's a picture of David there. He's a leader from Central New York in that image there. Next slide. So Shamika was already talking about this idea that identity first languages is, in my view, it's young advocates that are coming up, and it's some next wave of advocacy around language. And it talks about, some people want to be called autistic, for example, or deaf, as is on our next slide. So really, the point is to ask questions and not make assumptions. Don't correct others and make it about you. It's really about enforcing someone's choice and listening to where people are at. Do you want to say more about that?
Yeah, I think it's very important in our interactions, especially when it comes to a person that may have a disability and interacting with a person that may not have one. In my experience, that sometimes people can make it a lot about them, like they'll make every effort to go and help you without asking, or then they'll say, oh, I'm doing my good deed for the day, and it's very about them, and it's not really about me. So it's really, again, knowing who you're talking to, knowing what that person feels is important, and again, not correcting them because you may not feel comfortable with the word that they're using or the words that they're using. Have a dialogue about it. Have it, that we, you say, oh, this is how I see it. But if they're identifying their self as whatever it is, don't tell them that they are wrong, because then that furthers the problem of not being respected as a person and being who you are.
I think in a way, there's a lot of other reasons to ask people about how they describe themselves in terms of sexuality. It's good to ask someone how they describe themselves if that's a conversation you need to have with them, or in terms of gender as well. Some people, don't assume that they like the pronoun he, she. They may be prefer to be referred to as they. So there are a lot of reasons to kind of inquire when you get to that point with someone, how they identify themselves and how they'd like to be referred to. I think person first language, it comes from people having the strong experience of not being seen as a human being. And I think identity first language is coming out of people who are saying, I'm proud that I have this disability. And so there's a complexity to our experience and to the experience of disability that says, yes, we can do things. Yes, we are people, but we also have these differences. And I think that's what both of those things are kind of getting at. Can you go to the next slide?
Yeah, and I think one thing that's interesting is if you look at the history in civil rights movements, there's always been this reclamation of language, usually that was at one point considered derogatory. So you saw it in the civil rights movement around ethnicity and race, and you certainly saw it in the gay rights movement as far as reclaiming certain words that were originally seen as derogatory. And I think, as Sophia and Shamika pointed out, with the younger generation, I think this experience less overt discrimination around language. They're seeing reclaiming some of those words now as part of their identity.
And there's examples that have always been that way, like deaf culture. And deaf people are not disabled when they're around other deaf people who sign the same language. And so there's a pride in that, in being called deaf and not being called a person who has hearing impairments, because they may not be seen that as impairments. You can go to the next slide. Really, it is about seeing people, as having value and worth, and not looking at people from a medical model. and getting to know people as individuals and culturally getting to know the culture that a person is coming from. Next slide.
So when we talk about high functioning and low functioning, for many years prior to coming to Sanny's, I had worked in a department that served families and individuals and provided service. And one of the things that I found particularly frustrating was the way people dialogue about people with disabilities, using negative connotations, having, instead of saying positive things like X is good at understanding speech but sometimes needs support, it would be more clinical and less about the philosophy or being a human. There are a couple examples on this slide. X may not show interest in making decisions every time, but they still like to be given the opportunity. So there are different ways we can talk about diversity of skill set and be supportive of people's capacity and abilities to achieve than just being clinical and focusing on the things that someone may not achieve. We have one particular leader who likes to share a story about how he needs support getting out of bed each day. And he says, hey, it depends on the day. If I'm high functioning or low functioning, do people consider me to be low functioning because I can't get out of bed without support? So just being mindful about the language we use. When you use language that's more supportive of capacity and you're a role model for that, you'll see that other people will begin to adopt that language as well.
You know, and this slide kind of just goes over, you know, some things that you should do, you know, when communicating, you know, with a person with a disability, just kind of, you know, guidelines. You know, if you're doing a meeting, for instance, you know, providing information, make sure it's provided in alternative formats. You know, when you're, you know, going up to somebody, you know, offer to shake a person's hand, if that's usually how you, you know, when you're interacting with somebody, you know, and the person will tell you if that's not something that works for them. You know, treat adults as adults. You know, I know very often, you know, people, especially with various disabilities, have cognitive disabilities. People assume that you have a cognitive disability. So they'll talk to you as a child. Like I remember one instance, and I was going to the doctor. When I go to the doctor, sometimes I have to take meds beforehand. And so it's like 8 teaspoons of something. And the woman comes in and she goes, did you take your meds today? And I was like, yeah, I did. And she's like, I am so proud of you. You took 8 teaspoons all by yourself? And I'm like, oh, I'm never going to see this woman ever again. And so it's like, you know, the interaction, forgetting, and I remember after I left that appointment is I wrote a letter to them and say, tell your staff to treat adults like adults. You know, so, you know, just being mindful of how we are talking to people. You know, another thing that people feel, you know, talk a lot about boundaries and things like that. And people, you know, how people, I'll go to public places and people use me as a footrest, or they'll hang their jacket on me, or various other things that are just not appropriate at all. So it's all about just being mindful of how we are communicating, and again, having a conversation with the person that you are interacting with.
And just one other thing here.
Yeah.
Also remembering that communication is 2 things. It's talking and it's listening.
Yes.
You have 2 communication devices.
Right. Yes, exactly. That's very important, because sometimes when we are talking with somebody, we're just worrying about what's the next thing we get to say, right? Instead of like really listening. And also with that, you know, when you're talking about asking people if they need help, you know, listen to the answer, respect the answer. If the answer is no, then respect that, you know, because a lot of times what happens is people make the decision of what you need before they have any kind of communication with you. So if a person says no, then the answer is no. It really has nothing to do with you, again, not making it about you and the fact that you are trying to be helpful. And, you know, and just because that person may have a negative reaction, because some people may have a negative reaction to you asking if they need help, it doesn't mean that you should stop asking people if they need help. It's just that how that person is hearing that, and they're dealing with their own experience of disability. So I always tell people, you know, always ask questions no matter what, but you can't control how the other person perceives your question.
When you're talking, just to add, when you're talking to someone who does not speak verbally or who has a speech impairment, talk directly to the person. Even people who cannot speak verbally may be able to answer you in a different kind of a way, in a nonverbal way. Or even if they have an interpreter or someone speaking for them, still address the person directly themselves. And then when you're talking with someone with a speech impairment, my rule of thumb is always to just take it on yourself if you don't understand what they're saying. Don't act like there's something wrong with them. Act like there's something wrong with you that I couldn't understand or I couldn't hear what you were saying. And you can ask short questions that have a yes or no answer. If you have difficulty following, but the worst thing I see that people do that is a bit insulting to say, what did he say, and never talk to the person again. Mm-hmm. Some people are okay with that, but some people really have a problem with that. And I think a best rule of thumb is to just do your best to understand the person. And if you really can't, say, do you mind if I ask someone else, if you're with someone else, do you mind if I ask them if they can repeat that for me, because I'm just having a hard time focusing today, or I'm having a hard time understanding you.
Yeah, the other thing important is that don't pretend that you do understand when you don't. If you don't understand, just most people will be okay with you saying, can you repeat that? Or can you, or repeat what you thought you heard, so the person can tell you whether you are correct or not. But don't just say, oh, yes, that's great, when you didn't understand a word that the person said.
Okay, now we can go to the next slide.
Okay, so when we're talking about breaking barriers through understanding, we're talking about what keeps people down. So there are a variety of things that can keep people down: access to good health care, transportation, education, stereotyping, and marginalization. But there are other things like bias that we're not aware of. So when we're looking at changing the mindset of a community, we also need to be reflective of ourselves, our bias, the barriers that we may be presenting for someone, and also providing support for people to be their own best self by breaking those barriers, whether it be some kind of modification, coordinating transportation, changing the way we're distributing materials. Those things can be helpful when we're breaking barriers.
The next couple of slides are just about what some of the laws are. Do we need to actually go through?
I would paraphrase a few, maybe. Just paraphrase them a little bit.
One is the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which simply says, which prohibits discrimination against people receiving federal funds. Section 14 of the NCRR, Section 633.1 and 633.4 which is essentially New York State's version of what the federal law is. Protections. The ADA calls for non-discrimination against people with disabilities in 5 areas. 1, employment. 2, public services. 3, public accommodations. 4, telecommunications. And 5, miscellaneous provisions.
So just to chime in, Clint, when we're looking at protections and the law, we're saying, okay, we're supporting providers and others to understand about cultural competence. We're saying it's not only best practice, it's the law, okay? All right, so in order to create equity, there are a lot of things we can do to support people and to be more culturally competent and giving people the opportunity to work in equal footing. One particular example of that is a relay service, or some people may use an iPad, easy read documentation, pictures, technology, an interpreter. Just be mindful around these things. When we're talking about cultural competence, we have to factor in how people are communicating with each other and supporting people and meeting them in their place of need. Again, we always refer back to ask questions. When in doubt, ask questions.
Okay. As we stated before,
We're
sorry.
We're not there yet.
Sorry.
Yeah, we could do this one together. Let's do this one together.
No, you're right to go to the next slide. Sorry, we had skipped ahead.
Sorry. Okay. Tips on supporting people with diverse skill sets. You're providing, making sure that you're providing appropriate accommodations. Using, like we said, a variety of different documentation, such as pictures, easy read documents, written documents, having, services such as peer support, using things like iPads and iPhones, having things in different formats such as Braille and other languages, and using interpreters when needed as well.
So I like to look at the, okay, next slide.
Okay, and also, it's important, as we said before, to make sure that everyone understands what's going on. So if you're having a meeting or whatever, it's the basic thing is to, remind people of what you talked about, restate it, and then repeat it, making sure that everybody is on the same page and understands what's going on.
Okay, next slide. So marginalization is it's the idea of putting or keeping someone away from the inner workings of a group. And this is a social phenomenon that it affects many people. Can go to the next slide. Myself, I grew up in a family that's racially diverse in terms of disability, diverse in terms of gender and sexuality, class, and weight in my immediate family. And one of the things that I noticed in all of my growing up is that there are certain things that happen to people in marginalized groups kind of across the board. One of them is being invisible. And I can't tell you the number of conversations I've had or situations I've had where I'm with someone of color, I'm with someone with a disability, I'm with someone who's very large, and the person will be talking to them but looking at me. Had the experience myself as a woman speaking in a group of men, and they act like a wind just blew through the room. So these are common across different groups, and many of you may have some of these experiences yourself. Being invisible and not being heard is a common sign, a common experience, I think, for people in marginalized groups.
It's definitely, I see this too when even when I am with a friend that may have a more visible severe disability than I do, or may use a communication device. If they're using their communication device, they'll ask me questions about what that person is doing or whatever. So, it's always these things of people making assumptions, people assuming things about you before they actually talk to you, or they're letting their assumptions affect their communication with you.
So people may be outside the picture too, because all communication is by email, and they don't either have access or they don't read well. That type of thing is another example of how that comes into play. So this is a picture of Ed Roberts, and he's the father of the independent living movement. We just wanted to include this because this really this is all of our community in independent living and in self-advocacy, that our goal really is to change within ourselves and develop inclusive leadership. And when we do that, we will change the rest of society. So you can go forward.
When talking about stereotypes, one of the things that, people have assumptions about, what a specific group is about, say, oh, okay, when I'm interacting with somebody that's helping me, and they'll go, oh, well, you don't work, do you? And it's like, well, is that a question? Or, so they have these assumptions of what people with disabilities are capable of, and, have these ideals of what you can and cannot do, again, before they talk to you, and how that can be harmful.
Go to the next one.
Okay, so this inspiration porn is a term used to describe a common tendency in which able-bodied people condescend to those with disabilities by suggesting they're brave or special just for living. So I think that there's a good example of this that I've come across is really gifted musician Charles Mingus. He's considered one of the greatest jazz composers of the 20th century. And he was an African American. That's how he identified. And he said that he experienced, racism two different ways. And one was sort of that more conventional where you sort of put someone down. He used racial terms and all that. He said, that's his experience when he would join orchestras as a young musician. He's this virtuosic bass player. Is that people would either outright reject him, that more common form of discrimination. But he found on the reverse, it almost equally at times it happened where someone very well-meaning, some well-meaning white guy would kind of come up to him and take his sheet music off of his music stand and say, I know that you can't read music. I'm here to help you. I want to welcome you. So I think that, people with developmental disabilities often see this as well, this sort of lowering of expectations as opposed to the concept. If we talk about cultural competency in the workplace for people with developmental disabilities, I think one thing, I don't know if we've totally touched on yet, that's really important is the idea of having an expectation of competence, right? Mm-hmm. Making reasonable accommodations to promote success, but really expecting a valuable contribution and creating an environment and relations that are going to sort of promote real success, and not really celebrating things that aren't true successes in people's life. And I think that's kind of what this term came from, this inspiration porn. And I'm sure if you, if you look at some YouTube videos sometimes around, communities celebrating people with disabilities, and sometimes you'll see some very genuine, beautiful things. And sometimes you'll find some pretty shocking, content, along these lines of someone who's really not really accomplished something, or probably themselves doesn't have a great sense of meaning or accomplishment, and they're being celebrated simply because they are disabled and did something very fundamental.
Yeah, I am. Very often I always say people either see me as, poor, pitiful you, or you're a superhero for being able to buy a loaf of bread by yourself. So, people see me in the store and say, oh, I'm so glad you were able to get out today. And it's like, okay. So it's like, so that interaction, there's no just can we just have an interaction that doesn't, you know, treat me like a person, you know?
Yeah.
So,
So I like
To move on.
I like to describe it as going from caregiver to colleague. I think that's the best way to put it simply. Caregiver to colleague.
yeah.
That's great.
Right.
And
Next
that leads definitely into what we're talking about in terms of an inclusive leadership style. Just looking at the being aware, being curious, having cultural intelligence, meaning understanding that there are different ways that people do things, being forthright and being committed, and having some courage to make that stand that we are going to be inclusive, and we're going to take the time it takes to support diversity, and that it's important that people are at the table. You can go to the next slide. You know, so it's a choice, and we look at leadership comes up in all kinds of ways in different people. People who cannot speak can be leaders. People who can only speak 2 words can be leaders. People exercise their leadership in different ways, and really valuing that in a realistic way, not in this kind of inspiration porn way that we were talking about. Doing the right thing, seeing value in others for their gifts, seeing value in the practice that you're doing, as well as the outcome, and that those 2 things one doesn't cancel out, the productivity doesn't cancel out the methods that the integrity of what you're doing. Obviously treating people how you want to be treated, and being reflective, you know, and really, and looking at your own stuff. We all have to learn. None of us, we have not been born into the world that we would like to be living in, and for the most part. And so we are creating that in the way that we lead, in the way that we do our teams. And it's not always easy, and we need to be reflective with ourselves, and be gentle with ourselves, and kind as well. Next slide.
Okay. Aware, open, and respectful. Be aware of what we're bringing to the table, the ideas, thoughts, and bias that we could even unconsciously be bringing to the table. Be aware of the place and the needs of others, where they're coming from. Be open to seeing value and a contribution from all of the team members that you're working with, and respect. It all comes down to respect. Being able to ask questions when needed, being able to sit back and provide space for others to be leaders as well, and just treat each other like human beings.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. That's pretty much what the next slide is about.
Yep. So just valuing diversity and respect for all. Pretty much just valuing diversity means taking each person as they come as a new experience with someone to offer you something. It's a give and take relationship, not just, again, providing to support to someone, but seeing what you can learn from each other and building a relationship.
Yeah, the thing about that is when you have people coming into your homes or to your offices, it's presented often as they are the professional, they are the expert. I always tell people to look at it as whoever you are interacting with, be open to the fact that you can learn something from that person as much as they can learn something from you.
Exactly.
That's our presentation.
Questions?
So that's our presentation. You can find us on Facebook. There are lots and lots of resources. You know, this is a very basic overview, but there are certainly lots more resources and lots more detailed information. You can call our main office, and we also have regional offices across the state. In each major city across the state, we have a self-advocacy office, and can give you information, links to other kinds of, if you want to learn more or you would like materials to share with other people, we often have those kinds of materials. So I think we're going to hand it back to Suzanne for any questions or.
All right, so are there any questions? You can, again, either raise your hand with the menu bar, or you can write in the question box. So this was a very interesting presentation. I had never heard the inspiration porn phrase before, but it certainly resonates. So,
yeah, so some things, I mean, some things certainly are, you know, what people do sometimes is pretty amazing. It is pretty cool. And how do you do that without playing into that kind of like devil saint kind of thing? And how can we create it? You know, in that too, there's the question at the bottom of that slide was, does the actor have a disability? And the actor who plays the person with CP in the TV show is a disabled actor. And so looking at it's people, you know, it's not any person that has CP that's playing that character. It's an actor who he has the skills of an actor, and he is also disabled, you know. And I think you know, I think all of the movement is really just towards people being able to be seen. And I think even in a lot of the things that we present, rather than using these broad sweeping labels, rather than these broad sweeping ideas, that we're actually starting and we actually get to see people and talk about people as just people, and the details of those, you know, their lives and things like that. Yeah, absolutely.
all right, so if there's no questions, we'll just say thank you very much to Samies. We will be putting this recording up on the NYAIL website, and the PowerPoint will be available as well on the NYAIL website in the events and training section of the website. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out, and we can forward that on to the folks at Samies. So thank you again, everyone, and have a good day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.